Welcome to Vision and Voices. I'm Chris Mays, a partner at Armanino, where I lead our family office practice supporting ultra high net worth families with tax planning, outsourced family office services, and long-term strategy. Each episode features insights from professionals whose work shapes the family office ecosystem, from legal and investment experts to technologists and philanthropic advisors. Today's conversation focuses on financial planning with Jeff Coyle, founder of Libretto. Libretto helps families and their advisors make better decisions through advanced scenario modeling and clear financial storytelling. Jeff brings a deep expertise in fintech and a sharp point of view on how digital tools can strengthen long-term planning for wealthy families. We will cover how Libretto is changing the planning landscape, the common challenges families face when making multi-generational decisions, and how technology can turn complex data into practical strategy. Jeff, welcome to Vision and Voices.
Hey, thanks, Chris. It's nice to be here.
So, can you start by sharing a little bit about your background and what led you to found Libretto?
Oh, sure. I guess a simple way of looking at it is I've spent most of my career managing the wealth of the most affluent families. And I founded 3 ultra affluent firms catering to those types of clients. And then I've also built 3 systems for managing complex wealth. And it was completely out of self-defense because the systems didn't exist, and I needed the systems to be able to deliver more comprehensive, consistent, and scalable solutions. And so Libretto is really the result of all of that. As an example of the 3 systems, the last system I built was acquired by a large private bank, now runs that private bank. And I retired from that, working for a period of time, and had to build some tools to manage my own resources, started building what would eventually become Libretto. And the reason I did, I just figured out something that had eluded me for 2 decades, and it needed to be built. And therein lies Libretto.
So what were the specific gaps that you were trying to address that the other systems in the marketplace were not meeting your need?
There's a number of gaps, actually. The first thing is people aren't really managing total wealth. They tend to be managing a portfolio. And so when you think of total wealth, you think of a total wealth portfolio. And you want to incorporate their homes and their mortgages, their human capital, executive compensation. Social Security is a valuable inflation-protected bond folded into their structure. Incorporate their operating businesses, their properties, their private assets, their estate inflows, insurance payoffs. And so when you think about it, their portfolio, it's not a standalone, let's say 60-40, maybe the result of a questionnaire for that matter. It really behaves more like a completion fund. It needs to recognize all of those resources, and then the investable portfolio fills in the voids to create a comprehensive solution. So the first thing, go ahead, Chris.
So you're saying there's wealth outside of the what would you traditionally think of as the family's assets. So their stocks, bonds, private equity portfolios, et cetera. You're saying, okay, well, but they also may be earning money. They may have a private business, and they may have other insurance.
They have estate. Think in a multi-generational context. They probably have estate inflows that have yet to transfer, and they may or may not know the value of those inflows. But those inflows can be significant in their life. They may have expected insurance payoffs, or they may be involved in a transfer structure. Think of McGrath as an example. They certainly have homes and mortgages. Their mortgage, it's like an opaque type of leverage. People don't think about it. But what a mortgage is doing is it's elevating your exposure to risk assets. And in human capital, that's the present value for future earnings, or executive compensation, and so these things can be large resources. And so, we've been doing this for an awful long time. Just every household is worth substantially more than they think. It's just that they don't fully understand their total wealth because nobody's showing it to them.
Well, how do you put all that together then? How do you, when you say completion fund, it sounds how do you assess these other sources of wealth and how they dovetail with the financial assets, the traditional investments.
Well, what you can do is you can use, without getting too geeked on this, but you can use a present value framework. And what you're able to do is you're able to capitalize every resource that they have. So they may have an investable portfolio that you know the value of. They may have a piece of real estate, they have a business, but they don't know the value, the present value of their human capital, future earnings. They don't know the present value of their Social Security. It's surprisingly, for most retiring couples, it's worth about $2 million, plus or minus. And they haven't identified future inflow. A future inflow could be an estate inflow. They could be the beneficiary of a charitable trust. They don't know the assets, but they own the cash flows. So what you're able to do is, using a present value framework, you're basically able to aggregate all of their wealth, capitalizing inflows into the capital structure. Now you actually know their total wealth. And that is what's really powerful about it. Most people are worth substantially more than they actually think they are.
And okay, with this knowledge, then how does it change the way that they allocate their portfolio, or what benefit does this additional knowledge bring?
Oh, it empowers them to be effective with their wealth. And, kind of like, the key questions are not what's your risk tolerance. The key questions are, what's the purpose of your wealth? How much of that wealth would you dedicate to your personal lifestyle? What would you like to accomplish with your family, and why? And then how would you like to affect society in some positive way? Once you understand the purpose of the wealth, you can then identify each of the individual outcomes that somebody's trying to accomplish. They have an essential level of spending. You want to minimize risk and protect it. They have non-essential level of spending. You can take risk. They have objectives with the kids. They have objectives that relate to social impact. Once you understand those outcomes, you literally understand the timing and suitability of risk for every dollar they're going to spend. So as you articulate the purpose of your wealth, you're identifying exactly how to invest those assets. And that's where you can actually link, and we link an asset liability matching process. We identify the purpose, the timing, and the suitability of risk of every dollar they're going to spend, and then we can match suitable asset allocations to each one of those dollars. And if you know how to invest every dollar, you know how to invest every account, every entity, and that's rolling all the way up to the household portfolio. And then you can fold in the liquid investable portfolio to fill in the gaps around a total wealth structure that's incorporating their businesses, their homes, their human capital, their other resources.
So every dollar they're going to spend has so throughout their entire lifetime?
Yeah. So, as a simple example, let's say that somebody spends $1. The first thing you want to know is, well, how much that dollar is actually essential to them. And by the way, think food, shelter, and clothing. If we were back in deflation of the 30s, what could you get by on staying in your home and be just fine? Think of that as essential spending. You want to immunize that. You want to have super high confidence that if the world falls apart, you're still okay. And so we can identify, well, if that's the case, I'm thinking about immunizing their essential spending. We're going to apply protective assets. How would I invest that essential dollar I'm going to spend tomorrow? How would I invest that dollar I'm going to spend 20 years from now? We can identify that systematically. Now, on the other hand, they decide they want to help their kids buy a house. That's actually discretionary. And in meaning that when we say discretionary, what they're saying is, well, we can take risks and we don't need that money for another 10 years. And in that point, we now know they've got a discretionary risk-taking priority that shows up in about 10 years. We know exactly how to invest that dollar. And when you do that, you can actually make it so that in an interactive conversation with a client, you're actually helping them to articulate the purpose of their wealth. And as they do that, they're quite literally watching their portfolio being developed. And as I dig into this a little bit more, they'll also watch their management applications being identified. The same, yeah.
Yeah, no, keep going. So I'm still just trying to visualize the fact. So you're basically projecting consumption out over their lifespan, and you've got some essential spending, which, like, yeah, the dollar has to show up when that essential spending. So it can't be in equities, because, like, the dollar's got to be there. And if the dollar is 60 cents of the full dollar that needs to be spent, then okay, so I understand that. And then so but for things that are discretionary, I guess you have the choice of whether you spend the dollar or not. And so if the dollar's worth 60 cents or 20 cents or 120 cents, if it's worth 120 cents, you spend it. If it's worth 60 cents, you don't spend it.
That's exactly right. In fact, when you think about it, what you're doing is you first help families identify the purpose of their wealth. How much of that wealth are they going to dedicate to their personal lifestyle, their family, and their social impact? And then you help them to prioritize each of the individual outcomes. So they want to help their kids buy a house. They might want to give them a supplemental income so they can make a career decision not based on economics. They might want to pay for private education or a car when they get out of school. And then they'll have a series of objectives that relate to their social impact. Once they prioritize those.
Well, can you hold on? Like, their personal lifestyle. So, like, the personal lifestyle being different than essential spending, right? It's not just food, shelter. Versus when you say social, can you just, like, help me understand the difference between those two things?
Oh, sure. So think of personal lifestyle. Think of it as two different levels. Think of as essential spending. Let's say the world really falls.
The things that you mentioned before.
Yeah, the world really falls apart, and their business is worth zero, and it's not paying dividends, and their real estate's unoccupied, and they're not getting cash flows. They have expenses. What could they get by on and be okay? That's what essential spending is. Now, the other part of their spending, it's discretionary. So with an affluent family, it could be private travel. They've got a jet, and it costs a lot each year, but they don't have to have a jet. And so that could be a discretionary personal object. They might have a mind that they want to buy another home or a vessel of some kind. Those are discretionary. And so when you break them out into essential, you're saying, hey, let's minimize risk. Now we have an objective that's important to us. We can take a little bit of risk. And then we have an objective that's discretionary. We can take more risk. So what they're actually doing by prioritizing them is they're identifying the suitability of risk, quite literally, for every dollar they're going to spend. And then we can also look at each one of those priorities and know exactly when the money's needed. The kids are going to go to college from here to there. We know there are 4 years of dollars that are necessary. For the sake of it, I'll call it an important objective. And now we know the suitability of risk and the timing of every dollar they're going to spend. And then we can systematically match suitable asset allocations.
But what if the kids decide to go to grad school, or it takes them 5 years versus 4 years? Like, in order to make this work, do you need a super accurate projection?
The thing is, what you have at all times is the best projection with the information the family has. And life is iterative. That is the nature of life.
Yeah.
You don't buy a 60-40 portfolio and sit on it for the rest of your life. Life is iterative. And that is, by the way, the process of wealth management itself. Their portfolio over their life is going to need to adapt. Their insurance applications, their estate structures, their non-financial solutions, all of that needs to adapt. And you need to have a process that enables you to systematize all of that iteration.
Okay. I wanted to jump back because I think so you had essential and non-essential spending, and then and I think I got what the difference between those are, but you introduced important and discretionary spending. And I mean, both of those don't sound like essential.
Absolutely not.
What's the difference between Well, I mean, I guess like the title says it, discretionary is something you have a complete choice over. Important is something that's important, but like help me understand what type of expenses would be discretionary, what type of expenses would be important. And is it specific to the client or is it, or are you guys mandating that?
Oh no, the client with really the advisor's coaching is actually expressing these. They are actually prioritizing each of the outcomes that they have in mind with the guidance of their advisor, of course, coaching their advisor. So as a simple example, an important objective could be private education. Now, some people might say, well, that's essential. Well, it's
Right.
not essential. By the way, I don't mean to put my own framework on it. Somebody can actually work their way through college.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and so it's probably it tends to be important for most families.
Well, I have some clients would definitely say it's essential,
Well,
right? The
that's
private
fine.
education, clients live in New York and hey, private education is essential. So,
And by the way, that's a good point. And if they view it as essential, it is essential. And now
okay.
what you
So
do,
it's the client's perspective on it's the value they assign to that set of expenditures.
yeah. It's interesting, Chris. Years ago, I was working with a very successful person in the music industry. And this is when Spotify and everything was coming out, and his business just literally blew up. And one of the things that he had done is he had pre-funded all of his kids' education. To him, he said, that was the best thing I ever did. He said, because, the business blew up, but my kids, their education was already pre-identified and
When
pre-funded.
you said blew up, it blew up in a good way or it blew up in a bad
Oh, in
way?
a bad way,
Oh,
unfortunately.
it
Yeah.
got destroyed. Okay,
Yeah. I
yeah.
mean, he was a very talented individual. He rebuilt, but that change in the music industry unfortunately blew him up in a bad way. But he had to rebuild from scratch again. But the kids' education had already been pre-funded.
Okay.
And
So he did, in other words, that was essential spending for him. So he was great. Like it didn't matter what happened in he didn't need the dollars out of his business to pay for his kids' education. And so that was already taken care of. And
that's
I guess
exactly
that's what you mean by essential spending. Like you put the dollars somewhere where you know they're going to be available, regardless of what happens to your other assets.
an essential objective is something that you can't afford not to have. It's a must have. And when something's a must have, you want to minimize risk.
Yeah, I'm not putting my property tax payment in that's due next month in Bitcoin today because it might not be there.
That
Um,
is a perfect and obvious example of what I'm talking about. And what you do though is you systematize it though. So you say, okay,
so you
well,
basically take every single expense and you categorize it in these different buckets, and that becomes the basis for how you think about that money or how you invest those dollars.
yeah, if you want to be specific, Matt, let's say that somebody spends $1 every year, and then what you'd want to do is you'd want to deconstruct that dollar. And the first thing you would say is, well, how much of that dollar relates to our personal lifestyle? Extract out your family objectives and your social objectives. And the reason for that is that your personal lifestyle, that's an expense that you're going to have for the rest of your life, every year for the rest of your life. But the college education for your kids, it's going to happen in 8 years for another 6 years. It's a
Right.
different time frame, right?
Yeah.
And now you move over and say, well, here's their personal lifestyle. Well, but not every one of those dollars is going to happen for the rest of their life. They've got homes, and there's expenses that relate to those three homes. And it's highly unlikely that when they're 95, they're going to be moving between three different homes. So you can identify that their expenses will change over time, and you can pre-identify that. It's not hard to do. So think about it that you have, from a personal perspective, you have expenses that will occur for the rest of your life. And then you'll have expenses that will change over your life. It could be a second or third home expense, could be private travel, it could be a large worldwide vacation, it could be a number of different things. And so you break up their personal lifestyle into things that are foundational or for the rest of their life, and then things that will vary over their life. And this is not hard to do, but at this point, You now know every dollar they're going to spend. And you do the same thing with their social impact. People give to charity to meet the needs of the most needy. People also invest in politics as a way of causing change. They invest in ideas. How do you change people's perception about things? They're concerned about the environment. And so you can identify these. And once you understand the purpose of the wealth, you know exactly how to invest it.
So Libretto helps you systematize all of this and gives you a mechanism or a path to put this all together in a way that's comprehensible. Because I mean, like trying to think about every dollar that gets spent over the next 50 or 60 years. I mean, you'd probably be able to model that, but hard to use that for any, to make any decisions unless you have a really good way to organize that data.
Yeah, that's what technology is powerful. It can take a complex process and make it simple. So imagine that the first thing we started with is people have never seen their total wealth. And Libretto aggregates their total wealth. Now they're actually looking at their total wealth probably for the first time. And now you have a conversation with them. And you say, well, hey, how much of that wealth are you going to dedicate to your personal lifestyle? What do you want to accomplish with your family? Private education, homes, cars, weddings, supplemental incomes, as an example. What would you like to accomplish, or how do you want to affect society in some positive way? And as they articulate those specific outcomes that they have in mind, this is not hard to do. What happens is you're basically identifying the purpose of the wealth, and then we can then identify the timing and suitability of risk for every dollar they're going to spend. And then we can match suitable asset allocation to every dollar. So in that very high level, enjoyable conversation, that client will literally watch their portfolio being developed as they give the feedback with the coaching of their advisor. It's exactly what our systems do.
Okay.
You can create a pretty accurate structure in about 5 minutes with a client doing this.
Okay.
Now it takes
so real practical though, okay, so we've identified the client's essential, non-essential spending. How does that translate into how much fixed income, how much equity, how much liquidity? How does it, in real practical terms, how do you get from their spending to an asset allocation?
Yeah, I think the way that you do that is, so imagine, I'll just take 2 examples. You have an essential dollar that they'll spend tomorrow. How would you hold those dollars? In cash.
Yeah. Yeah.
You have an essential dollar that they're going to spend 10 years from now. How would you hold that?
Is a single dollar? I'm
using the dollar as they spend more than $1. But
well, yeah, I understand that. But okay, so if for $1's worth of spending in 10 years, it's like a zero, like a 10-year a zero treasury bond would probably be the least risky way of ensuring that I have that dollar in 10 years.
That's exactly right, almost. Because the first thing you'd want to say is, well, what's the characteristic of that dollar of spending? And one, it's essential, so minimize risk. But 2, that's going to suggest the treasury that you're talking about. Yeah. And by the way, there are reasons to use other securities like munis as an example, but that's a longer conversation. But the second thing about that dollar is it's inflation adjusted. So if we have an inflation.
Yeah, not just a dollar plus inflation. Okay, yeah. So a tip or something like that.
That's exactly right. So the first thing you would say is, what kind of investment would I use to create high confidence I can spend that dollar in 10 years? And the answer would be, the dollar is inflation adjusted. You'd actually want it to be an inflation adjusted 10-year treasury.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And what we just did there is we just created a hedge. Because if interest rates or inflation move up or down, the cost of funding that dollar is going to go up or down. But the value of that bond goes up or down by the same amount. And it really doesn't matter. And that's how you create confidence. is you put a hedge in place.
Okay. Okay. So in other words, you look at all this essential spending over their lifespan, and you basically create a portfolio of fixed income that can hedge out all of those dollars, depending upon like are they subject to inflation, or are they like all of the characteristics of that future spend. You're basically just creating a portfolio to hedge that out.
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And now what you have is you have their essential need should be met regardless of pretty much what the world throws.
Whatever happens in the world. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
And then moving to non-essential, so important and spending. What like okay, so you've got that portion of the portfolio. It's protecting against each essential dollar that has to be spent. Now go up from there, like important, discretionary, like how do you hedge those dollars?
Well, what you're doing is on essential, you're actually going to put a hedge in place. When you move to, and by the way, think of essential as foundational, minimize risk. Now you move to what your client says is important, then we can take some risk. And then when something's discretionary, it's just discretionary. You can take a lot more risk. So as you prioritize something, it tells you how much risk is suitable to take. So when you move into risk, you're no longer hedging something. You're saying to yourself, hey, I'm willing to take risk because if I take risk, I'll get a higher return and it'll cost me less to fund that objective because I'm getting a higher return.
Got it. Okay, but there's still a difference between something that is important and something that is, discretionary by virtue of being, I can make a decision. So how are you delineating between, those two types of future, like that consumption?
Yeah. And first of all, I don't want to be prescriptive, but because every family or household has a different answer to these things. It's really the framework that matters. And so giving an example, most people think of education as important, not as essential.
Right.
Now, it doesn't mean that family A might say, well, no,
it's not discretionary, but it's like, hey, I'm gonna do this unless I'm in some predicament financially.
Yeah. And so let's say that I'll make this story. Let's say that someone's going to pay for education for a grandchild, and that's going to start in 7 years and go for 6 years after that. How would I invest that dollar if I think of it as important? I'll make a guess. It's probably 70% equity, 30% fixed income. Now let's say it's no longer 7 years away, it's 3 years away. Well, how would I invest that now? Well,
less equity.
Pardon?
Less equity.
Less equity, exactly. So what happens is when you use this framework, you know how to invest a 7-year dollar. But when that 7-year dollar becomes a 5-year, a 3-year, a 2-year, you're going to slowly remove the equity. So by the time it's ready to spend, it's worth $1.
Yeah.
There is risk, but the risk is being mitigated by time. And the client is saying, hey, this is not essential to me. We can take some risk. And so when you think about it, really the suitability of risk plus time, it tells us how to invest every dollar.
Yeah. No, it's like that house remodel is discretionary until the point you sign the contract with the general contractor, and all of a sudden now I got to fund those, my obligations under that contract.
That's absolutely true. So let's say that somebody said, hey, I want to buy a vessel of some kind, and I'm going to do that in 5 years. It's discretionary. We don't have to do it. But now fast forward 4 years past, they put in an order for the vessel, and now it's under construction. And now all of a sudden, it's no longer discretionary. It's essential. They've got a contractual obligation to it. You would change how you would invest those dollars. And you would be doing that between now and 5 years anyway. But I'm trying to highlight that there is a difference between a discretionary dollar versus an essential dollar. A nice way of thinking about a discretionary dollar is often social impact. And I don't mean to say that it's discretionary, because it's not necessarily discretionary, but that's where risk is really to the benefit. Because normally over time, you get paid for taking risk. And so if you're taking risk on your social dollar, your social impact is the beneficiary of that risk most of the time. And if you are unfortunate and you do experience the bad side of risk, well, you just don't give as many dollars. But when you think about it, taking risk on a social impact is generally something that's positive, because your social objectives are generally the beneficiary of it. Not always, but generally the beneficiary of it.
Yeah. 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 So I would think some of my clients would probably put a higher priority to their social impact, because, a lot of them, they would worry that if we're in some kind of financial distress at large with the economy, that other people won't give to the things that they value the most. And so they would it probably wouldn't be discretionary for them at some level. It'd probably be important, might even be essential for some. Like they're going to want to make sure that they can keep that organization going regardless of what kind of financial peril the world at large is in.
Yes, but remember, everything's a trade-off.
Right. It's more, what you're saying is it's more expensive in today's dollars.
Yeah. So I'm being overly simplistic. So if you wanted high level of confidence, super high level of confidence that you could fund something, it might cost you twice as much.
Right.
As if you said, well, hey, I'm willing to take the risk. And that's the question, is where are you willing to take the risk? Because, and this is where, I don't want to be prescriptive, this is where social impact is interesting. Because you could say, well, I could cause the following to happen if I'm not willing to take any risk, or I have the potential to cause 2x that if I'm willing to take risk on that.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. It becomes a lot less expensive in today's dollars if you're willing to take some risk, but it's at the expense of being able to do it. Now that is the fundamental trade-off. So, okay, so Libretto then helps you put this whole thing together and, be able to see these different trade-offs and helps you make decisions around this.
Yeah, when you think about it, the first thing Libretto does, it illuminates someone's total wealth. Like I said, it's the first time they've seen it. The second thing, it enables them to allocate that wealth. How much they're going to dedicate to their lifestyle, their family, their social objectives. They then take each one of those individual objectives and they prioritize them. Is this objective essential to me? Is it important? Can I take some risk on it? Or is it discretionary? Can I take more risk? And as they do that, we know the timing and suitability of risk for every dollar. We align suitable asset allocations. They now have a personalized total wealth portfolio incorporating every resource they own. And they watch all that happen.
Okay. And so who are the users of Libretto? I mean, like what types of, who do you sell to?
Financial advisors. And they could be a family office, they could be a multifamily office, they could be a high net worth RIA or a traditional RIA. And really, the people that are using our systems are financial advisors.
Well, if you're valuing Social Security, you're not just family offices, because Social Security, $2 million of even of present value is not really, it typically isn't significant. So it works with just pedestrian millionaires as well?
It's funny. I almost think it's more important. And by the way, when I say it's more important, it's within context. That is that if you're worth a lot of money, you can make mistakes.
Yeah, right.
If you're not worth a lot of money,
you can't afford to make any mistakes.
So if you were to take a typical mass affluent household and they've got a $2 million portfolio, their house is worth $1 million, they think they're worth $3 million. But what they probably don't know is they have the present value of their Social Security, it's worth about $2 million.
Right.
And
So what you're saying is basically, what is that? 40% of your assets is in Social Security, and that's, I think you said a a really high quality asset.
Well, Social Security is an illiquid, inflation protected bond, perfectly matched to the way they spend money. If they don't know they've got $2 million sitting in an inflation protected bond, which is creating a hedge against their spending, you can be pretty sure that $2 million portfolio has very little relevance to their needs. Most people in or many people in mass affluence are over allocated to fixed income because they're unaware of the role that Social Security plays in their
Yeah.
total wealth.
I mean, some questions about the viability of Social Security long term, but I guess you could haircut the value assigned to that Social Security as well.
Yeah, we have tools in the system that'll enable people to apply a level of skepticism to it.
Right.
But can I say one other thing about this is even if you're worth 50 million, I'll say 50 is not a trivial amount of money. If you're worth 50 million, their Social Security is going to probably be a third of their bond structure.
Yeah, no, that's a good point.
It's not irrelevant. Yeah.
Right. You will be over allocated to fixed income. In that sense, 100% you'll be over allocated to fixed income because
if you're worth north of $1 billion, Social Security is irrelevant.
Irrelevant, right?
Irrelevant. I mean, you pay attention to every detail, but it's irrelevant in the scheme of things.
Yeah. So, and then you said human capital, so you can also put their salary into the tool.
Yeah. Human capital, you really want to think about it as kind of, you have base earnings. What's your base? What's your base you get paid? You may have some profitability cash bonus that you receive based on firm profitability. But, you also may have incentive stock as well, or options. And each one of those components of your human capital, you treat differently. So if you have incentive stock, you would fold that into the investment structure of the client's portfolio. Your future earnings, your cash compensation is recognized as a future resource. And so it's folded into their overall structure, suitable to the type of resource that it is.
Right. But like you can't, I mean, okay, your salary is not, I guess like I'd rather have my salary is not a treasury, right? It's not a muni, not like, ignoring even the tax characteristic of it. I'd much rather have an income stream coming from a treasury portfolio than I would salary because I could always be fired, So how do you differentiate between the risk of those two different earning streams?
Well, you do it slightly differently based upon wealth level. And so let me give you an example. I'll start at a low wealth level. Is most people that are building wealth today, their human capital absolutely dominates their wealth, just dominates their wealth. And they're completely unaware of it. And what's interesting about it, most people are already financially successful. They just don't know it because they don't appreciate the value of their human capital or their Social Security that relies on that human capital. So in order to be financially successful, they only need to do really two things. Just don't spend too much, size their life to their resources. And then secondly, make sure they realize their human capital. And so this is where risk management comes into play. If I wanted to make sure I realized my human capital, what would I do? I would buy life insurance. I'd buy disability insurance as much as I can get. And then I'd want a protective reserve, small pool of money held in short-term fixed income. So if I lose my job in a downturn, I've got the time to retrain, find another job, and start saving again without having to sell my risk assets in distress or maybe sell my home and displace my family.
Right.
So when you think about it, that's where risk management comes in. And then now you move out to a more affluent, let's say you've got an executive as an example in a corporation. You'd be thinking the same types of things because their human capital in dollar terms is going to be worth an awful lot more. You want to be thinking about the underlying risk and how you're folding in their incentive compensation into their portfolio. And that's why your liquid assets become a completion fund. If you've got a massive heavy concentration in incentive stock, you want to make sure that's going to be offset. You've got the right amount of protections held in fixed income, as an example. And that's how these things all integrate with one another.
Okay. Well, look, this has been a great conversation. Really enjoyed you coming on Visions and Voices. If people want to get in contact with you for a demo of Libretto, how would they go about doing that?
I'll just go to our website, libretto.io. And
I'll put it in the show notes for sure.
Yeah, and there will be you click a button, set up a meeting, and we would look forward to talking to you.
Jeff, thank you so much. This was fun.
Oh, this is super. Thanks, Chris.
All right. Take care.